The gunshot that shattered the afternoon stillness sent Tabitha Daniels's heart hammering against her ribs as she urged her mare forward with desperate kicks. The animal's sides heaving beneath her legs while dust exploded around them in choking clouds that burned her throat and eyes. She had been riding for nearly an hour since leaving the ranch where she'd been working as a cook, but the 4 men pursuing her showed no signs of tiring, and their shouts echoed across the sagebrush-dotted landscape like the baying of wolves closing in on wounded prey. Her fingers ached from gripping the reins so tightly, and sweat plastered her cotton dress to her back, despite the cool October air that swept down from the mountains surrounding Challis, Idaho, in this year of 1883. The mare stumbled over a rock, and Tabitha felt her stomach drop as the horse recovered just barely, hooves scraping against loose stones that scattered down the hillside they were traversing. Behind her, the men were gaining ground, their larger horses bred for endurance rather than the quick sprints her smaller mare excelled at, and she knew with sinking certainty that she couldn't outrun them much longer. The Salmon River Valley stretched out before her, beautiful and indifferent to her terror, the water glinting silver in the afternoon sun while cottonwoods stood like silent sentinels along the banks. She had made the mistake of overhearing something she shouldn't have when delivering lunch to the bunkhouse that morning. The 4 ranch hands, recently hired by the foreman while the owner was away in Boise on business, had been discussing their plans to rob the stage that ran between Challis and Salmon City, and when one of them had glanced up to see her frozen in the doorway with a tray of food, their eyes had met, and she'd known immediately that they couldn't let her live to tell anyone what she'd heard. She dropped the tray and run, barely making it to the stable and onto her horse before they'd come after her. And now here she was, racing for her life across terrain she knew well from her rides into town but which offered precious little cover. Another gunshot cracked through the air, and this time she heard the bullet whine past her head close enough that her hair stirred in its wake. They weren't trying to wound her anymore, she realized with cold clarity. They meant to kill her and leave her body for the coyotes to find. Just another unfortunate accident in a territory where death came easily to the careless and unlucky. Her brother had died that way 3 years ago, thrown from a horse and breaking his neck, and her parents had followed within a year. Her mother from pneumonia and her father from the whiskey he'd used to drown his grief. At 22 years old, Tabitha had been alone in the world, working whatever job she could find to keep herself fed and housed, and she'd thought the position at the Clearwater Ranch had been a blessing when she'd been hired 2 months ago. The landscape blurred past her as tears of frustration and fear stung her eyes, mixing with the dust until her vision swam. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus, because losing her way now would mean certain death, and scanned the terrain ahead for any possibility of escape or shelter. The road to town lay miles to the east, too far to reach before they caught her, and the mountains rising to the west were too steep for her tired horse to climb with any speed. She was trapped between the river and her pursuers, and desperation clawed at her chest like a living thing trying to escape. Then she saw him, a lone rider on a powerful bay horse emerging from a stand of cottonwoods perhaps 200 yards ahead, positioned where the trail she was following intersected with another path that led down from the higher elevations. Even at this distance, she could see he sat his saddle with the easy confidence of a man born to it, his shoulders broad beneath a worn leather vest, and his hat pulled low against the sun. For a heartbeat she wondered if he might be another threat, a 5th member of the gang she'd somehow missed. But then he moved and she saw him wheel his horse to face her pursuers, placing himself directly in their path. The four men behind her had seen him too, and their shouts changed from triumphant to angry as they realized someone was interfering with their chase. Tabitha's mare was flagging badly now, foam flecking her neck and her breathing coming in harsh gasps that spoke of impending collapse. So she pulled the animal back to a slower pace and glanced over her shoulder to see what would happen. The stranger had positioned himself in a narrow section of the trail, where the hillside rose steeply on one side and dropped away toward the river on the other, creating a natural choke point that forced the pursuers to either go through him or take a long detour around. They chose to go through him, their leader spurring his horse forward with a curse she could hear even from her distance, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. The stranger didn't move, didn't reach for his own weapon, just sat there like a statue carved from granite while the gap between them closed with terrifying speed. Tabitha found herself holding her breath, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. And when the lead pursuer was perhaps 20 feet away, the stranger finally moved. His hand came up holding a rifle she hadn't seen him draw, the weapon appearing in his grip like magic, and the crack of the shot echoed across the valley, loud enough to send birds exploding from the trees along the river. The bullet struck the ground directly in front of the lead horse's hooves, sending up a spray of dirt and stones that made the animal rear back with a scream of fear, nearly unseating its rider, who grabbed frantically at the saddle horn to keep from being thrown. The other three men hauled back on their reins, their horses dancing and snorting as they tried to settle the spooked animals. "That's far enough," the stranger called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance with a tone that brooked no argument. "Turn around and ride back the way you came." The leader of the pursuers, a tall man with a scarred face that Tabitha recognized as Jack Riley, one of the newer hands at the ranch, straightened in his saddle and glared at the stranger with pure venom. "This ain't your business, mister. That woman stole from us, and we mean to get our property back. She doesn't look like she's carrying anything but herself," the stranger replied, his rifle still trained on the group with unwavering steadiness. "And even if she did steal something, I doubt it's worth dying over. So I'll ask you one more time, polite as I can manage. Turn around." Riley's hand twitched toward his gun, but one of his companions grabbed his arm and said something too low for Tabitha to hear. The stranger had the advantage of position and the element of surprise, and more importantly, he held himself with the quiet competence of someone who knew exactly how to use the weapon in his hands. The four men seemed to realize simultaneously that pushing this confrontation would end badly for them, and after a tense moment where Tabitha thought her heart might actually stop beating, Riley spat on the ground and jerked his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he shouted, but there was defeat in his voice beneath the bluster. "We'll remember this." "I'm sure you will," the stranger said mildly, "but I'd suggest you spend your time remembering to find honest work instead of chasing down young women." The four men rode back the way they'd come, casting dark looks over their shoulders but making no move to continue their pursuit. Tabitha watched them go until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, and only then did she allow herself to slump forward in her saddle, her entire body shaking with reaction now that the immediate danger had passed. Her mare stood with her head hanging low, sides heaving like a bellows, and Tabitha realized with guilt that she'd pushed the animal nearly to the point of collapse. The stranger approached slowly, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening as he drew closer. Now that she could see him properly, Tabitha realized he was younger than she'd first thought, probably somewhere in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of mountain storms beneath the brim of his hat. His face had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, with small lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though his expression right now was serious and assessing as he looked her over. "Are you hurt?" he asked, swinging down from his horse with fluid grace and approaching her with his hands visible and empty, the rifle now secured in its scabbard on his saddle. Tabitha tried to speak, but her throat had closed up, whether from the dust, or from fear, or from simple relief she couldn't say, and she could only shake her head mutely. Her hands trembled so badly when she tried to dismount that she nearly fell, but the stranger moved quickly to steady her, his grip on her elbow firm but gentle as he helped her down to solid ground. Her legs felt like water beneath her, and she might have collapsed if he hadn't supported her weight until she found her balance. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice pitched low and soothing like he was talking to a skittish horse. "You're safe. They're gone and they won't be coming back, not while I'm here." "Thank you," Tabitha managed to croak out, her voice raw and broken. "They were going to kill me. They would have killed me if you hadn't stopped them." His expression darkened at that, his jaw tightening beneath the stubble that covered his cheeks. "What did you do to make them that angry? And don't tell me you stole something, because I could see from a mile away that was a lie." She hesitated, unsure how much to tell this stranger who had saved her life but whom she knew nothing about beyond his willingness to intervene. But something in his steady gaze and the way he'd positioned himself without hesitation between her and danger made her think he could be trusted, and the words came spilling out in a rush as she told him about overhearing the conversation, about the planned robbery, about her desperate flight from the ranch. He listened without interrupting, his attention focused completely on her face as she spoke, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Those men are planning to rob the Salmon City stage." "When?" "Tomorrow," Tabitha said, remembering the details of the conversation she'd overheard. "They said it would be carrying a large payroll for one of the mining operations up north, and that the guard would be the only real threat." "We need to get to town and tell the sheriff," the stranger said decisively. "But first we need to see to your horse. She's about done in, and we need to let her rest before we push her any further." He led both horses down to the river, moving with the confident ease of someone completely at home in this landscape, and Tabitha followed on shaky legs that gradually steadied as the adrenaline began to fade from her system. The riverbank was lined with smooth stones worn round by centuries of water flow, and the cottonwoods cast dappled shade that felt blessedly cool after the intensity of the chase. The stranger let both horses drink, though he carefully monitored how much he allowed them to take, and then he produced a rag from his saddlebag and began wiping down Tabitha's mare with careful attention to the places where sweat had soaked through. "I'm Harrison Nichols," he said as he worked, glancing up at her with those storm-colored eyes. "I run a small cattle operation about 10 miles north of here, up in the mountains where there's good grazing and water year-round." "Tabitha Daniels," she replied, wrapping her arms around herself even though she wasn't cold. "I've been working as a cook at the Clearwater Ranch, or at least I was until this morning. I don't suppose I can go back there now." Harrison's expression turned thoughtful as he finished with her horse and started checking his own mount, running his hands down the bay's legs with practiced movements. "The Clearwater Ranch. That's owned by Samuel Patterson, isn't it? I've met him a few times in town. He's a decent man, but he's been having trouble keeping good help lately." "These 4 were new," Tabitha confirmed. "Hired about 3 weeks ago when several of the regular hands quit. I should have known something was wrong when they showed up, but I was just grateful to have the work, and I kept to myself in the kitchen most of the time." "It's not your fault," Harrison said firmly, straightening to his full height, which put him a good 6 inches taller than her own 5 feet and 4 inches. You couldn't have known they were planning something like this. But you did the right thing running when you realized you were in danger, and now we can stop them before they hurt anyone else. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reflected off the river's surface in shimmering bands of color. Tabitha realized with a start that it would be dark in a few hours, and the thought of riding through the wilderness at night made her shiver despite the warmth that still lingered in the air. Harrison noticed her reaction and frowned slightly, clearly thinking through their options. "It's about 5 miles to Challies from here," he said slowly. "We could make it before full dark if we take it easy on the horses, but your mare needs rest more than she needs another hard ride. There's an old line shack about 2 miles east of here that belongs to the Patterson place. It's not much, but it has a roof and walls, and we could spend the night there and ride into town first thing in the morning." The idea of being alone with a strange man in an isolated cabin should have frightened her, but Tabitha found that she wasn't afraid of Harrison Nichols. He'd had ample opportunity to harm her if that had been his intention, and instead he'd saved her life and shown nothing but concern for her welfare and that of her exhausted horse. Besides, she thought with weary practicality, after everything she'd been through today, sleeping in a cabin with a stranger who'd proven himself trustworthy seemed far less dangerous than pushing her horse to collapse or riding through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. "That sounds sensible," she said, managing a small smile that felt strange on her dust-caked face. "I'm not sure my mare could make it another 5 miles anyway, not without proper rest." Harrison returned her smile with one of his own, and she was struck by how it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger and more approachable. "The line shack it is then. Come on, we should get moving while we still have good light. The trail isn't difficult, but it helps to be able to see where you're going." He helped her back onto her mare with the same gentle courtesy he'd shown throughout their brief acquaintance, and they set off at an easy walk that allowed the horses to recover while still making progress. Harrison positioned himself between her and the direction her pursuers had gone, she noticed, keeping himself as a barrier between her and any potential threat, even though the danger seemed to have passed. The gesture touched her more than she would have expected, a tangible reminder that there were still good people in the world despite all the hardship and loss she'd experienced. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip of hooves on stone, the rush of the river beside them, and the evening songs of birds settling into the trees for the night. Tabitha found her gaze drawn to Harrison's profile, taking in the strong line of his jaw and the way he sat his saddle with unconscious grace, completely at ease in his surroundings. There was something solid about him, she thought, something dependable that made her feel safer than she'd felt in longer than she could remember. "How did you happen to be there?" she asked eventually, curiosity overcoming her exhaustion. "It seemed like you appeared out of nowhere, right when I needed help most." Harrison glanced over at her, his expression thoughtful. "I'd been checking on some of my cattle in the high pastures and was heading back home when I heard the gunshots. When I came down to investigate, I saw you riding like all the demons of hell were after you, and those 4 men chasing you with guns drawn. Didn't take much thinking to figure out what was happening." "Most people would have just kept riding," Tabitha said softly. "It's not safe to get involved in other people's troubles out here. My father always taught me that a man who won't stand up when he sees something wrong isn't much of a man at all," Harrison replied, his voice carrying a note of conviction that suggested this, was a deeply held belief rather than empty words. Besides, I couldn't just ride away knowing someone was in danger. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I'd done nothing and later found out those men had hurt you. They rode on as the light continued to fade, the shadows lengthening across the valley floor and the temperature dropping as the sun sank lower. Tabitha's dress, still damp with sweat from her flight, began to feel clammy against her skin, and she shivered again, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to generate warmth. Harrison noticed immediately and shrugged out of his leather vest without comment, walking his horse close enough to drape it over her shoulders before she could protest. "But you'll be cold," she objected, even as she pulled the vest tighter around herself and felt grateful for its warmth and the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to the fabric. "I'll be fine," Harrison assured her. "I'm used to being out in all weather, and I'd rather be a little chilly than have you freeze." The line shack appeared as darkness was beginning to settle in earnest, a small structure built of weathered logs with a stone chimney at one end and a lean-to stable attached to the side. It looked sturdy enough despite its obvious age, and Tabitha felt a rush of relief at the prospect of getting out of the wind that had picked up as the temperature dropped. Harrison dismounted first and checked the area carefully before helping her down, his caution making her realize that he was still concerned about the possibility of her pursuers doubling back. "Wait here while I check inside," he said, pulling his rifle from its scabbard and approaching the cabin door with careful steps. Tabitha stood holding the horse's reins and watching as he disappeared into the dark interior, and a moment later warm light bloomed as he struck a match and lit a lantern that must have been left inside. He emerged a few moments later looking satisfied and gestured for her to come in. The interior of the line shack was sparse but clean, consisting of a single room with a rough table and 2 chairs, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, and a narrow bed built into the wall with what looked like a reasonably fresh mattress covered in blankets. A few supplies lined shelves on the far wall, basic staples like coffee and beans and flour in sealed containers that protected them from rodents. And someone had left a stack of firewood beside the stove that spoke of regular maintenance, even if the cabin wasn't currently occupied. "I'll see to the horses and then get a fire going," Harrison said, already turning back toward the door. "You should sit down and rest. You've had one hell of a day." Tabitha was too tired to argue, and she sank into one of the chairs with a gratitude that made her bones ache. Now that the immediate danger had passed, and she was somewhere safe, the full weight of exhaustion was crashing over her like a wave, leaving her feeling hollowed out and fragile. Her hands were still trembling slightly when she laid them flat on the table, and she stared at them for a long moment, wondering at how quickly a normal day could transform into a fight for survival. Harrison returned after tending the horses, his arms full of firewood which he fed into the stove with practiced efficiency. Soon flames were crackling cheerfully, and the temperature in the small space began to rise, driving away the chill that had seeped into her bones. He filled a battered coffee pot with water from a canteen and set it on the stove to heat, then rummaged through the supplies and produced a tin of beans and some hardtack that he regarded with an apologetic expression. "It's not much," he said, "but it's food and we should both eat something." They prepared the simple meal together, falling into an easy rhythm as Harrison heated the beans and Tabitha found plates and utensils in a small cupboard. The activity felt almost domestic, strangely normal after the chaos of the afternoon, and she found herself relaxing in his presence despite the circumstances. When they finally sat down to eat, she realized she was ravenous, having had nothing since the breakfast she'd gulped down before starting her morning chores at the ranch what felt like a lifetime ago. "Tell me about your ranch," she said between bites, wanting to think about something other than her own troubles. "You said it's up in the mountains." Harrison's face lit up when he talked about his land, his passion for the work evident in every word. He'd inherited the property from his father 2 years ago. He explained, after the older man had passed away from a fever that the doctor in Challies hadn't been able to cure. His mother had died when he was young, leaving just Harrison and his father to work the place, and they'd built it up from nothing into a modest but successful operation with about 200 head of cattle and good water rights that were increasingly valuable in this dry country. "It's beautiful up there," he said, his eyes distant as if seeing it in his mind. "In the summer the meadows are full of wildflowers, and in the winter the snow comes down so thick you can barely see your hand in front of your face. It's isolated, which suits me fine. I've never been much for crowds and town life." "Don't you get lonely?" Tabitha asked, genuinely curious. "Living up there by yourself with no one to talk to?" Harrison shrugged, a slightly self-conscious gesture that made him seem younger and more vulnerable. "Sometimes. But I have my work and my animals, and I make it into town often enough to keep from going completely wild. I've thought about hiring a hand or two to help with the spring roundup, but I'm particular about who I let onto my land, and I haven't found anyone I trust enough yet." She understood that, she thought. Trust was hard won and easily lost, especially in a territory where strangers came and went with the seasons, and you never knew who might decide your possessions or your life were worth taking. She'd learned that lesson the hard way after her parents died, when supposed friends and neighbors had circled like vultures, helping themselves to everything her family had owned while she'd been too lost in grief to stop them. "What about you?" Harrison asked, his tone gentle. "You said your family is gone. Do you have anyone else, other relatives or friends who could help you?" Tabitha shook her head, swallowing past the lump that rose in her throat. "No one. My parents were only children, so no aunts or uncles or cousins, and I haven't had much opportunity to make friends since they died. I've been moving from job to job, trying to save enough money to maybe buy a little place of my own someday, somewhere I could feel settled and secure." "That's a good dream," Harrison said quietly. "Everyone deserves to have a place they can call home." They finished their meal and Harrison insisted on cleaning up while Tabitha sat and tried not to fall asleep in her chair. The warmth from the stove and the food in her belly were conspiring to drag her toward unconsciousness, and she found her eyes drifting closed despite her best efforts to stay awake and alert. When Harrison gently touched her shoulder, she jerked awake with a small gasp, momentarily disoriented. "Sorry," he said, pulling his hand back quickly. "I didn't mean to startle you, but you should get some sleep. You can take the bed and I'll make a pallet on the floor." "That's not fair," Tabitha protested, even though the thought of lying down on something soft sounded like paradise. "You saved my life and you've been nothing but kind to me. I can't take the only bed." "You can and you will," Harrison said firmly but not unkindly. "I've slept in worse places than a warm floor and you need the rest more than I do. Please don't argue. Let me do this one thing." She was too tired to fight him, and the bed looked increasingly inviting as exhaustion pulled at her limbs. Harrison turned his back to give her privacy as she removed her boots and lay down fully clothed, pulling the blankets up to her chin and feeling the tension begin to drain from her muscles as the soft mattress cradled her aching body. She heard him moving around the cabin, banking the fire and arranging blankets on the floor near the stove, and then the lantern light dimmed, and darkness settled over the small space like a comfortable shroud. "Harrison," she said quietly into the darkness, not sure if he was still awake. Yes. Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't come along. There was a pause, and then his voice came back warm and sincere. You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad I was in the right place at the right time. Now get some sleep. We've got a ride ahead of us tomorrow. Tabitha closed her eyes and let herself drift, feeling safer than she had in years despite the strangeness of the situation. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that Harrison Nichols was unlike any man she'd ever met, and that she was grateful beyond words that fate had brought them together on this particular October day in 1883. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Harrison moving quietly around the cabin, trying not to disturb her. Dawn light was creeping through the single window, painting everything in shades of gray and pink, and she sat up slowly, feeling the various aches and pains from yesterday's hard riding announce themselves throughout her body. Harrison glanced over when he heard her stirring and offered a small smile. Morning. How did you sleep? Better than I expected, Tabitha admitted, pushing her tangled hair back from her face and wishing she had a brush, or at least some way to make herself more presentable. What time is it? Early yet, but I figured we should get moving as soon as possible. Those men might have gone back to the ranch last night, or they might be out looking for us. Either way, the sooner we get to town and talk to the sheriff, the better. He poured her a cup of coffee, and she accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm tin and taking a careful sip of the strong, bitter brew. They shared a quick breakfast of leftover beans and the last of the hardtack, and then Harrison banked the fire and they prepared to leave. The horses looked much better after their night of rest, and Tabitha's mare even whickered softly when she approached, butting her head against Tabitha's shoulder in a gesture of affection that made her smile despite her nervousness about the day ahead. The ride to Challies took just over 2 hours at the steady pace Harrison set, and they arrived in town to find the main street already busy with morning activity. Challies wasn't large, just a single main street lined with buildings that served the ranchers and miners who worked in the surrounding territory. But it was prosperous enough with a general store, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a hotel, and the sheriff's office that was their destination. Harrison led them directly there, tying their horses to the rail outside and helping Tabitha down before ushering her through the door. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and a face weathered by decades of dealing with the harder side of human nature. He looked up from the paperwork on his desk when they entered, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp attention when he took in Tabitha's disheveled appearance and the serious look on Harrison's face. "Harrison," he said by way of greeting, rising from his chair. "What's going on?" Harrison gestured for Tabitha to sit in one of the chairs facing the desk, and she did so gratefully, suddenly aware of how exhausted she still felt. Then he launched into an explanation of everything that had happened, starting with Tabitha overhearing the planned robbery and ending with his intervention and their night at the line shack. The sheriff listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively grimmer as the story unfolded, and when Harrison finished he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. "Jack Riley and his boys," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "I knew there was something off about that bunch when they rode through here a few weeks back. Had that look about them, you know. The kind of men who are always looking for an angle, a way to make easy money without honest work. They're planning to hit the stage tomorrow," Harrison reminded him. "Assuming they haven't changed their plans now that Miss Daniels got away. They might figure she'll be too scared to talk," the sheriff mused, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Or they might push the job up to today, try to get it done before she can raise an alarm." Either way, we need to be ready for them. He stood and crossed to a gun cabinet on the wall, pulling out a shotgun and checking to make sure it was loaded. I'll get my deputy and we'll ride out to meet the stage, make sure it arrives safely. Harrison, I'd appreciate it if you'd come along. You're good in a tight spot and I might need the extra gun. Of course, Harrison said without hesitation, then glanced at Tabitha with concern clear in his eyes. But what about Miss Daniels? Those men threatened her, and they know she can identify them. She's not safe walking around town by herself. The sheriff considered this, then nodded slowly. You're right. Miss Daniels, do you have somewhere you can go, someone you can stay with while we deal with this? Tabitha shook her head mutely, feeling suddenly lost and vulnerable. She had no friends in Challies, no one who would take her in, and the thought of sitting alone in a hotel room waiting to find out if the men who tried to kill her had been caught was almost unbearable. She can stay at my ranch, Harrison said suddenly, and both Tabitha and the sheriff turned to look at him in surprise. He met their gazes steadily, his jaw set in a determined line. It's isolated and secure, and no one would think to look for her there. I can take her up there now and be back in time to help with the stage. Harrison, I can't ask you to do that, Tabitha protested, even though the offer sent a warm rush of gratitude through her chest. You've already done so much, and this isn't your problem to solve. You're not asking, I'm offering, Harrison said firmly. And it became my problem the moment I decided to help you yesterday. I'm not going to leave you unprotected now. The sheriff looked between them for a long moment, then shrugged. If the lady is agreeable, it sounds like a good solution to me. Harrison's place is defensible and far enough out that those men would have a hard time finding it even if they tried. And I'd feel better knowing she was somewhere safe while we're dealing with this business. Tabitha wanted to argue further, to insist that she'd imposed on Harrison enough already. But the truth was that his offer made her feel safer than any alternative she could think of. The idea of being alone right now, vulnerable and exposed while violent men who wanted her dead were still out there, made her stomach churn with anxiety. And there was something else too, something she was hesitant to examine too closely. The thought of spending more time with Harrison, of seeing his ranch and learning more about this man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. All right, she said quietly. Thank you. I accept your offer. Harrison's face relaxed into a smile that made something flutter in her chest, and he turned back to the sheriff. How long do you think this will take? Hard to say. If the robbers hit the stage today, we should have it resolved by nightfall. If they wait until tomorrow, might be another day after that before we track them down. You planning to stay up at your place until we give you the all clear? That seems wisest, Harrison agreed. Send word when you've got them in custody, and we'll come back to town, so Miss Daniels can give her statement. They worked out a few more details, and then Harrison and Tabitha were back outside in the morning sunlight, the sounds of the town going about its business surrounding them like a reassuring blanket of normalcy. Harrison glanced at the general store across the street and then at Tabitha, taking in her worn dress and disheveled appearance with an assessing eye that held no judgment, only practical concern. We should get you some supplies before we head up, he said. Some proper clothes for riding and working around a ranch, and anything else you might need for the next few days. I don't have much money, Tabitha admitted, feeling her cheeks heat with embarrassment. Just a few dollars from my last wages. Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better, Harrison said easily. But I'm not taking you up into the mountains without making sure you have what you need first. The weather can turn fast this time of year, and you need to be prepared. They spent the next hour in the general store, And Tabitha found herself caught between mortification at accepting Harrison's charity and gratitude for his thoughtfulness, as he insisted she pick out sturdy canvas pants suitable for riding, several warm flannel shirts, a proper coat lined with sheepskin, and new boots that actually fit properly instead of the worn-out pair she'd been making do with for months. He added other supplies to the pile as well: coffee and flour and bacon, a few tins of peaches that he said were his personal weakness, and a box of ammunition for his rifle that made her remember with a chill that danger was still very real and present. The storekeeper, a plump woman named Mrs. Henderson, who seemed to know Harrison well, gave Tabitha a curious but not unkind look as she tallied up their purchases. "Taking on a housekeeper, Harrison?" she asked with a note of teasing in her voice. "Just helping a friend who's had some trouble," Harrison replied evenly, his tone making it clear that he didn't welcome further questions. Mrs. Henderson took the hint and finished wrapping their purchases without comment, though Tabitha caught the speculative gleam in her eye and knew that by evening the whole town would be buzzing with speculation about Harrison Nichols and the mysterious woman he'd taken under his protection. They loaded the supplies onto Harrison's horse, and Tabitha changed into her new riding clothes in the small room at the back of the store that Mrs. Henderson offered for the purpose. When she emerged, feeling strange but also more properly equipped than she'd been in years, Harrison's eyes widened slightly and he quickly looked away, but not before she caught an expression on his face that made her pulse quicken. It wasn't anything improper, just a flash of masculine appreciation that he clearly hadn't meant for her to see, and it reminded her that, beneath their practical arrangements and the danger that had thrown them together, they were still a man and a woman spending time alone together. The ride up to Harrison's ranch took most of the afternoon, the trail climbing steadily into the mountains through stands of pine and aspen that were beginning to turn gold with the advancing season. The air grew cooler and thinner as they gained elevation, and Tabitha found herself grateful for the warm coat Harrison had insisted she buy. He rode ahead of her on the narrow trail, his body moving with the rhythm of his horse like they were one creature, and she found her gaze drawn to the width of his shoulders and the capable way he handled his mount and their surroundings. They talked as they rode, their conversation flowing easily as they shared stories about their lives and their dreams for the future. Tabitha learned that Harrison had always wanted to expand his herd and maybe start breeding horses as well, that he played the harmonica though not very well, and that his favorite time of year was early spring when the calves were being born, and everything felt full of possibility. In turn, she told him about her childhood before her family fell apart, about the books she loved to read when she could get her hands on them, and about her secret dream of one day opening a small restaurant where she could cook the recipes her mother had taught her. "You're a good cook?" Harrison asked, glancing back at her with interest. "I think so," Tabitha said, trying not to sound boastful. "My mother taught me everything she knew, and I've always loved experimenting with flavors and trying new things. The work I was doing at the Clearwater Ranch was pretty basic, just feeding ranch hands who cared more about quantity than quality, but I enjoyed it anyway." "I'd like to taste your cooking sometime," Harrison said, and there was something in his voice that made the simple statement feel like more than just casual interest. "Real cooking, I mean, not just beans and hardtack." "I'd be happy to cook for you," Tabitha replied, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of the ride. "It's the least I can do after everything you've done for me." The ranch appeared as they crested a final rise, and Tabitha caught her breath at the sight spread out before her. Harrison had undersold the beauty of his property, she thought. The cabin was larger than the line shack they'd stayed in, A solid structure built of logs with a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning sun, and a stone chimney that spoke of winter warmth. Beyond the cabin were several outbuildings, including a good-sized barn, a chicken coop, and what looked like a smokehouse. But it was the setting that truly took her breath away. The cabin sat in a high valley surrounded by mountains on three sides, with a clear stream running through the meadow where cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Aspens clustered along the stream bank, their leaves shimmering gold in the light, and above it all the peaks rose like sentinels, already dusted with early snow that gleamed white against the deep blue sky. "It's beautiful," Tabitha breathed, unable to find more adequate words for the surge of emotion the sight evoked. "Harrison, this is absolutely beautiful." His face lit up with pleasure at her reaction, and she realized that her opinion mattered to him, that he cared what she thought of this place he'd built. "I'm glad you think so. Come on, let me show you around." He helped her dismount, and they led the horses to the barn, which proved to be as well maintained as everything else on the property. Several stalls held fresh hay, and the tack hanging on the walls was clean and properly cared for. A huge draft horse looked up from his feed as they entered, regarding them with mild curiosity before returning his attention to more important matters. Harrison introduced him as Brutus and explained that he used the big horse for heavy work like pulling a plow or dragging logs. After tending to the horses, Harrison showed her the rest of the property with obvious pride. The chicken coop held about 24 hens and one aggressive rooster who tried to chase them away, until Harrison shooed him off with practiced ease. The smokehouse contained several sides of cured meat hanging from the rafters. The root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin was stocked with preserved vegetables and fruits, evidence of careful preparation for the long mountain winter ahead. Finally, he led her into the cabin itself, and Tabitha felt herself relax as soon as she crossed the threshold. Unlike the sparse line shack, this was clearly a home lived in and cared for. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and comfortable furniture arranged to take advantage of its warmth. Rugs covered the plank floor and curtains hung at the windows, small touches that spoke of someone who cared about making a house into a home. Through a doorway, she could see what looked like a bedroom, and a ladder in the corner led up to what was probably a sleeping loft. "It's not fancy," Harrison said, sounding almost apologetic, "but it's comfortable and it keeps the weather out." "It's wonderful," Tabitha said honestly, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "You've built something really special here, Harrison. You should be proud." He ducked his head, looking pleased and a bit embarrassed by her praise. "I'll need to head back down to town soon if I'm going to make it in time to help the sheriff with the stage. Will you be all right here by yourself until I get back?" The question sent a small flutter of anxiety through her chest, but Tabitha pushed it aside and nodded. "I'll be fine. You said yourself this place is secure and isolated. I'll just lock the door and wait for you to return." "There's a rifle over the fireplace and it's loaded," Harrison said, his expression serious. "I pray you won't need it, but if anyone comes around who shouldn't be here, don't hesitate to use it. And there's food in the pantry. Help yourself to anything you want." "Be careful," Tabitha said, surprising herself by reaching out to touch his arm. "Those men are dangerous, and I don't want you getting hurt because of me." Harrison covered her hand with his own, his palm warm and calloused from hard work, and looked down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll be careful, and I'll be back as soon as I can. I promise." He left a few minutes later after giving her a few more instructions about the property, and making her promise again that she'd keep the door locked and stay alert. Tabitha watched from the porch as he rode back down the trail, her hand raised in farewell, and she stayed there until he disappeared from sight, and she was alone for the first time since he'd ridden into her life the day before. The silence that settled over the valley after he left felt different from the isolation she'd experienced in other places. It wasn't oppressive or frightening, but rather peaceful in a way that soothed something deep in her soul that had been jangled and raw for far too long. She stood on the porch for a long time, watching the sun sink lower toward the western peaks and listening to the sounds of the ranch. The gentle lowing of cattle, the splash of water over stones in the stream, the evening calls of birds settling in for the night. Eventually, the cooling air drove her inside, and she set about making herself useful. The cabin was reasonably clean but showed the signs of being occupied by a bachelor who did his best, but didn't always have time for the niceties. Tabitha found herself falling into familiar rhythms as she tidied and organized, swept the floors and washed the few dishes that sat in the basin by the hand pump. She found supplies in the pantry and put together a stew that she hung over the fire to simmer. Adding herbs from a small garden plot she'd noticed behind the cabin that somehow managed to thrive despite the elevation. As darkness fell and she lit the lanterns, Tabitha realized that for the first time in years she felt something like contentment. The cabin was warm and cozy, filled with the good smells of cooking food and the crackle of the fire. She was safe, protected not just by walls and distance, but by the care of a man who'd proven himself worthy of trust. And as she settled into one of the comfortable chairs by the fire with a book she'd found on a shelf, she allowed herself to acknowledge the thought that had been growing in the back of her mind since Harrison had first stepped into her life. She was falling for him. Despite the short time they'd known each other, despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, she could feel herself drawn to Harrison Nichols in a way she'd never experienced before. It wasn't just gratitude, though she was certainly grateful for his help. It wasn't just attraction, though she couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her with those storm-colored eyes. It was something deeper, a recognition that whispered this could be right, this could be real, this could be the person you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, and she tried to push it away by focusing on her book. But the words swam on the page, and she found herself reading the same paragraph over and over without comprehension. Finally, she gave up and let her mind wander where it would, thinking about Harrison and his kindness, his strength, the way he defended her without hesitation, and then cared for her with such gentle concern. She must have dozed off at some point because she woke with a start to find the fire burned down to embers and the cabin dark except for one guttering lantern. For a moment she was disoriented, uncertain where she was, and then memory flooded back and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. A glance at the window showed full darkness outside, and she had no idea how long she'd been asleep or what time it was. A sound outside made her freeze, her ears straining to identify it. Hoofbeats, she realized, multiple horses approaching the cabin. Her first thought was that Harrison had returned, but then she remembered he'd ridden out alone, and these were definitely multiple animals. Fear gripped her chest like a vise as she remembered his warning about the rifle over the fireplace, and she moved quickly to retrieve it, her hands shaking as she checked to make sure it was loaded the way he'd shown her. The hoofbeats stopped outside the cabin, and she heard men's voices, rough and angry, though she couldn't make out the words through the thick log walls. Someone tried the door, finding it locked as she'd promised Harrison, And then there was the sound of footsteps on the porch and a face appeared at the window, pressed against the glass as someone tried to peer inside. Tabitha's breath caught in her throat as she recognized Jack Riley's scarred features, and she stepped back instinctively, the rifle clutched in her white-knuckled grip. He must have seen the movement because his eyes narrowed and he pulled back from the window, shouting something to his companions. A moment later, something heavy slammed against the door, making the frame shudder, and she realized with sick certainty that they were trying to break in. "We know you're in there, girl," Riley's voice called out, muffled but audible through the door. "Just come out peaceable-like and no one needs to get hurt. We just want to make sure you understand that keeping your mouth shut about what you heard would be in everyone's best interest." Tabitha didn't believe for a second that they'd let her live if she opened that door. She'd seen their faces, heard their plans, and could testify against them. The only reason she was still alive was because Harrison had intervened, and now he wasn't here to protect her. She was on her own, and the rifle in her hands was the only thing standing between her and certain death. The door shuddered again under another heavy blow, and she heard the wood begin to crack. They'd be through in another minute or two at most, and then she'd have to make a choice. Surrender and hope for mercy that would never come, or fight and probably die, but at least go down trying to defend herself. Her hand steadied on the rifle as determination flowed through her, replacing fear with a cold resolve. If they were going to take her life, she'd make them pay for it. The door splintered on the third blow, hanging askew on its hinges, and Jack Riley stepped through with his gun drawn and a nasty smile on his scarred face. "There you are, sweetheart. Why don't you put down that rifle before someone gets hurt?" "Stay back," Tabitha warned, raising the weapon to her shoulder the way Harrison had quickly demonstrated when showing her where it was. Her voice only shook a little, and she saw Riley's eyes narrow as he realized she meant business. "You even know how to use that thing." He sneered, taking another step into the cabin. Behind him, two more men crowded through the broken doorway, both armed and looking eager for violence. Tabitha pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder hard enough to send her staggering back, and the roar of the shot in the confined space was deafening. She'd been aiming for Riley's chest, but the kick threw off her aim, and the bullet went wide, punching through the wall beside his head and making him dive to the side with a curse. His companions scattered, one of them returning fire with a pistol that sent splinters flying from the doorframe near where Tabitha had taken cover behind the heavy table. She worked the rifle's lever with shaking hands, chambering another round, and fired again. This time, she hit one of the men in the shoulder and he went down with a scream, his gun clattering across the floor. But Riley and the third man were advancing now, using the furniture for cover, and Tabitha knew with sinking certainty that she couldn't hold them off much longer. She had maybe 2 more shots before they reached her, and then it would be over. The thunder of hoofbeats outside was so unexpected that everyone froze for a heartbeat, and then Harrison's voice rang out clear and commanding. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." Relief, so intense, it made her dizzy, flooded through Tabitha's chest, and she saw the same realization dawn on Riley's face. He was trapped between a woman with a rifle inside and armed men outside, with one of his companions already wounded, and likely another confronting whoever had arrived with Harrison. He glanced at the third man, some unspoken communication passing between them, and then he raised his hand slowly. "We're coming out," he called, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Don't shoot." Harrison appeared in the doorway a moment later, his rifle trained on Riley with unwavering steadiness. And behind him, Tabitha could see Sheriff Bradley and another man she didn't recognize. They quickly disarmed Riley and his companions, shackling them with iron manacles that made it clear they wouldn't be threatening anyone else anytime soon. The wounded man was groaning and clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers, and the sheriff called for someone to fetch the doctor. Only when the prisoners had been secured and led outside did Harrison lower his weapon and turn to Tabitha. His face was pale beneath his tan, and his eyes were wide with what looked like fear, and he crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, pulling her into his arms with a fierceness that drove the breath from her lungs. "God, I thought I'd be too late," he said roughly, his voice shaking against her hair. "We caught them trying to rob the stage this afternoon, and they broke under questioning, told us they'd sent one man to watch my place, and the others had ridden ahead to try to get to you. I rode as hard as I could, but I was so afraid I wouldn't make it in time." Tabitha dropped the rifle and wrapped her arms around his waist, holding onto him like a lifeline as reaction set in, and her whole body began to tremble. "You made it," she whispered. "You came back just like you promised." They stood like that for a long moment, clinging to each other while the sheriff and his men dealt with the prisoners outside. When they finally pulled apart, Harrison's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gentle as they brushed away tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. "You were so brave," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "You held them off all by yourself. I'm so proud of you." "I was terrified," Tabitha admitted, "but I remembered what you said about fighting when you need to, and I couldn't just let them take me without trying." "Thank God for that," Harrison murmured, and then, before she could think or react, he was kissing her. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he was giving her the chance to pull away. But Tabitha had no intention of pulling away. She kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion of the last 2 days, all her fear and relief, and the growing feelings she'd been trying not to examine too closely. His arms tightened around her, and the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, and for a few precious moments nothing existed except the two of them, and the connection sparking to life between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers and let out a shaky laugh. "I've been wanting to do that since I first saw you," he confessed. "I know the timing is terrible and we barely know each other, but Tabitha, I can't deny what I'm feeling. You've gotten under my skin in a way no woman ever has before." "I feel it too," Tabitha whispered, her hands fisted in his shirt as if she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "I thought I was going crazy, feeling this much this fast, but Harrison, I think I'm falling in love with you." His smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds, brilliant and warm and full of joy. "Thank God, because I'm already there. I love you, Tabitha Daniels. I know it's fast and I know we should probably take our time and do this properly, but I can't help how I feel and I don't want to." The sheriff's voice calling from outside broke the moment, reminding them that they still had practical matters to deal with. Harrison pressed one more quick kiss to her lips and then pulled away reluctantly, keeping her hand clasped in his as they went out to face the aftermath of the night's violence. The next few hours passed in a blur of statements and questions and explanations. The sheriff took detailed accounts from both of them about everything that had happened, and a doctor who'd ridden up with the posse tended to the wounded outlaw's shoulder while expressing his professional opinion that the man would survive to stand trial. The other members of the gang had already been secured in the Challies jail, and these 4 would join them there as soon as they could be transported down from the mountain. It was well past midnight by the time the sheriff and his men finally departed, leading the shackled prisoners on a slow ride back to town through the darkness. Harrison stood on the porch with Tabitha tucked against his side, watching until the line of torches disappeared down the trail, and then he turned to survey the damage to his cabin door with a rueful expression. "I can fix that tomorrow," he said, more to himself than to her. "For tonight, I'll nail some boards across it and we'll make do." "I'm sorry," Tabitha said, guilt washing through her. "They wouldn't have come here if not for me. They wouldn't have broken your door and shot holes in your walls." "Don't," Harrison said firmly, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "Don't apologize for something that wasn't your fault. Those men made their choices and they'll pay for them. And I'd fix 1,000 doors if it meant keeping you safe." They went back inside, and Harrison set about making temporary repairs, while Tabitha surveyed the cabin's interior. Her stew had boiled over during the confrontation, making a mess on the hearth, and there were bullet holes in the walls and overturned furniture where people had taken cover during the brief gunfight. It would take work to set everything right again, but at least no one had been killed and the danger was finally, truly over. "You must be exhausted," Harrison said when he'd finished securing the door. "Why don't you take the bedroom and get some proper rest?" "I'll sleep out here and keep watch, just in case." "Just in case of what?" Tabitha asked. "The sheriff has all of them in custody. There's no more danger." "I know, but I'll rest easier if I'm keeping an eye on things. Humor me." She could see the concern in his eyes and knew that arguing would be pointless. He needed to do this, needed to feel like he was protecting her even though the threat had passed. So she nodded and let him show her to the bedroom, which proved to be as comfortable and well appointed as the rest of the cabin. The bed was large and covered with quilts that looked handmade, and the room smelled faintly of pine and the outdoors. "Tabitha," Harrison said from the doorway as she was pulling off her boots. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "I meant what I said earlier, about loving you. I know we need to take things slow and do this properly, but I want you to know that my intentions are completely honorable. I'm not the kind of man who says things he doesn't mean." "I know," Tabitha said softly. "And I meant what I said too. I love you, Harrison. I don't understand how it happened so fast, but I do." He smiled, that brilliant expression that transformed his whole face and closed the distance between them to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Get some sleep. We'll talk more in the morning when we're both thinking clearly." But sleep was elusive despite her exhaustion. Tabitha lay in Harrison's bed, surrounded by his scent and the evidence of his life, and her mind raced with everything that had happened and everything that might come next. She'd found something here in this mountain valley that she'd thought was lost to her forever. Safety, security, and a sense of belonging. And more than that, she'd found a man who looked at her like she was precious, who'd risked his own life to save hers, who made her feel things she'd never experienced before. The future stretched out before her full of possibility, and for the first time in years, Tabitha allowed herself to hope. She must have eventually drifted off, because she woke to morning sunlight streaming through the window, and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the main room. She rose and dressed quickly, finger combing her hair into some semblance of order before venturing out to find Harrison at the stove, cooking breakfast with the same easy competence he seemed to bring to everything he did. "Morning," he said, his smile warm and intimate in a way that made her stomach flutter. "I hope you slept well." "I did eventually. What about you?" "Well enough. I kept the fire going and dozed some in the chair. Nothing disturbed the peace except an owl hunting around the barn." They ate breakfast together, the domesticity of the moment not lost on either of them. This could be her life, Tabitha thought as she watched Harrison across the table. Waking up to him every morning, sharing meals and work and quiet moments, building something real and lasting together. The thought should have frightened her with its intensity, but instead it felt right in a way nothing had in a very long time. "What happens now?" she asked when they'd finished eating and were working together to clean up. "The sheriff said he'd need us to come back to town to give formal statements for the trial. We'll go down in a day or two once I've got the cabin repairs finished," Harrison said. "And then, well, that depends on you." "On me." He set down the dish he'd been drying and turned to face her fully, his expression serious but hopeful. "Tabitha, I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other a few days and that most people would say we're crazy for feeling what we feel so quickly. But I'm not a young man anymore, and I've learned that when something is right, you don't question it. You just hold on tight and thank whatever providence brought it into your life." Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat as she waited for him to continue. "I want you to stay here," Harrison said. "Not as a guest or someone I'm protecting, but as my wife. I want to marry you, Tabitha. I want to build a life with you here in this valley, raise a family if we're blessed with children, grow old together watching the seasons change. I know I'm not wealthy and this life is hard sometimes, isolated and demanding, but I can promise you that I'll work every day to make you happy and keep you safe. I'll cherish you and respect you and love you with everything I have. So what do you say? Will you marry me?" The words she'd been about to say died on her lips as emotion overwhelmed her. This man, this good and honorable man, was offering her everything she dreamed of and more. A home, a partner, a future full of love and possibility. How could she say anything but yes? "Yes," she whispered, and then louder with more certainty. "Yes, Harrison, I'll marry you. I want all of that, everything you described. I want to build a life with you." His whoop of joy echoed off the cabin walls as he swept her up into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that made her toes curl, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all her love and hope and happiness into the connection between them. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and preparation. They rode down to Challies to give their statements to the sheriff, and were told that Jack Riley and his gang would face trial for attempted murder, attempted robbery, and a list of other charges that would likely see them spending decades behind bars. The news that Harrison Nichols and Tabitha Daniels were engaged to be married spread through the small town like wildfire, and while there were certainly people who thought the courtship was scandalously quick, most folks seemed genuinely happy for them. The ranch owner, Samuel Patterson, once he returned from Boys and learned what had happened with his hired men, was horrified and apologetic. He offered Tabitha a generous settlement for the danger she'd been in, which she accepted gratefully, as it gave her something to contribute to her new household beyond just herself. He also threw his support behind the upcoming wedding, offering the use of his ranch for the celebration, since it was larger and more accessible than Harrison's mountain property. They were married on a crisp November morning with most of Challies in attendance, the ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through town at just the right time. Tabitha wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson from the general store had helped her pick out, and Harrison looked handsome in a new suit that he tugged at uncomfortably, until she took his hand and smiled at him. The vows they spoke were traditional but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared drew cheers and applause from the assembled crowd. The celebration that followed was lively and warm, full of good food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. But both Harrison and Tabitha were eager to return to the mountain ranch that was now their shared home, and as the sun began to set they made their excuses and rode out together, their horses, hooves keeping time with the beating of their hearts. The cabin looked beautiful in the twilight, lamplight glowing welcomingly from the windows and smoke curling from the chimney. Harrison had spent the previous week making repairs and improvements, fixing the damage from the confrontation and adding little touches he thought Tabitha might like. New curtains in the bedroom, a rocking chair by the fireplace, a shelf for the books she was slowly accumulating. He'd even built a proper writing desk where she could work on the recipes she was starting to collect, dreaming of the restaurant she still hoped to open someday. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that felt both exciting and right. Harrison was gentle with her inexperience, taking his time to make sure she felt cherished and desired. And when they finally came together, it was with a sense of completion that went beyond the physical. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, talking quietly about their dreams and plans until sleep claimed them both. The winter that followed was cold and snowy, just as Harrison had warned, but Tabitha found that she loved the isolation and the beauty of the season. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, helping with the animals and the endless tasks that kept a homestead running. She experimented in the kitchen, creating dishes that made Harrison groan with pleasure and beg for seconds. She read by the fire on long evenings while Harrison played his harmonica, the simple melodies filling the cabin with warmth. And she fell more deeply in love with her husband with each passing day. He was everything he'd promised and more. Hardworking and honest, affectionate and considerate, with a dry sense of humor that often caught her by surprise and left her laughing. He consulted her on decisions about the ranch, valuing her opinions and treating her as a true partner rather than simply a wife to be commanded. And he showed her in 1,000 small ways every day that she was loved and treasured. Spring arrived in an explosion of green and gold, the snow melting to reveal meadows full of wildflowers just as Harrison had described. The cattle that had weathered the winter in the lower pastures were driven back up to the high country, and Tabitha learned to ride well enough to help with the work. She proved to have a good eye for the animals and a knack for spotting potential problems before they became serious, and Harrison started consulting her on breeding decisions and herd management. In May, she realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror, as she thought about bringing a child into the world when she'd lost so many of her own family members. But Harrison's reaction when she told him that evening after dinner banished her fears. He gathered her into his arms with tears in his eyes and whispered that she'd just made him the happiest man alive, and his careful tenderness in the weeks that followed reassured her that they would face this adventure together, just as they'd faced everything else. The baby was born in February, during a fierce snowstorm that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Harrison delivered his son with shaking hands and fierce concentration, following the instructions from the medical book they'd purchased in town and praying harder than he'd ever prayed in his life. When the baby's first cry filled the cabin, lusty and strong, they both wept with relief and joy. They named him Thomas, after Tabitha's father, and he was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to take after his father in temperament. Easygoing and content, unless he was hungry or needed changing, at which point he made his displeasure known with impressive volume. Watching Harrison with their son made Tabitha fall in love with her husband all over again. He was gentle and patient, willing to wake for nighttime feedings and walk the floor when the baby was fussy. And the sight of her big, strong cowboy cradling their tiny child never failed to make her heart swell. The years flowed past like the stream that ran through their valley, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. They added to their cabin, building on a room for Thomas and later another for his sister Lily, who arrived 2 years after him, and then a third for baby James, who completed their family. The ranch prospered under their joint management, the herd growing and their reputation for quality cattle spreading throughout the territory. When Idaho achieved statehood in 1890, they rode into Challis with their children to celebrate, and Tabitha felt a fierce pride in being part of this growing region. She'd put down roots here, built a life and a family, and belonged in a way she'd never thought possible during those dark days after her parents died. In 1895, she finally opened her restaurant in Challis, a small establishment that seated about 20 people and served meals made from recipes she'd perfected over years of cooking for her family, and the ranch hands they now employed during busy seasons. Harrison had encouraged her to pursue her dream, even helping with the construction and managing the ranch solo when she needed to be in town. The restaurant was an immediate success, drawing people from surrounding areas who'd heard about the quality of the food, and Tabitha found deep satisfaction in the work even as she balanced it with her responsibilities at home. Their children grew strong and healthy, learning the ways of the ranch and the value of hard work from their father, and the art of cooking and the importance of community from their mother. Thomas proved to be a natural with horses and eventually took over the breeding program his father had started. Lily had her mother's gift with food and her father's head for business, and she started helping in the restaurant as soon as she was old enough. James, the baby of the family, surprised them all by developing a passion for learning and eventually going to the Territorial College in Boise to study law. Through it all, through the good times and the inevitable difficulties that came with ranching and raising a family, Harrison and Tabitha's love remained constant. They still took time for quiet evenings by the fire, still made each other laugh with shared jokes and memories, still looked at each other across a crowded room and felt that spark of recognition and rightness that had brought them together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Harrison took Tabitha on a ride up to the high meadow where the wildflowers grew thickest in early summer. They spread a blanket on the grass and ate the lunch she'd packed while the horses grazed nearby and the sun warmed their faces. The view stretched out before them in all directions: their valley, their ranch, the mountains that had witnessed their vows and sheltered their dreams. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked quietly, reaching over to lace his fingers through hers. Saying yes so quickly, tying yourself to a simple rancher and this isolated life. Tabitha turned to look at her husband, taking in the silver that now threaded through his dark hair and the deeper lines around his eyes, the evidence of 2 decades spent working outdoors and building a legacy. He was even more handsome to her now than he'd been that day he'd ridden into her life like an answer to a prayer, because now she knew him completely. His strengths and his weaknesses, his dreams and his fears, the depth of his capacity for love. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly, squeezing his hand. "You saved my life that day, Harrison, in more ways than you know, and every day since then has been a gift. This life, this family, this love we've built together, it's everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dared to hope for." He smiled, that brilliant expression she'd fallen in love with, and pulled her close for a kiss that still had the power to make her heart race after all these years. "I love you, Tabitha Nichols, today, tomorrow, and all the days after that. And I love you," she whispered against his lips. "My cowboy, my hero, my home." They sat together as the afternoon sun painted the mountains gold, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The wind whispered through the grass, and the cattle lowed in the distance, and everything was exactly as it should be. The years continued their steady march, bringing changes but never diminishing the bond between Harrison and Tabitha. Their children grew into capable adults who made them proud in different ways. Thomas took over more of the ranch operations as Harrison's joints began to protest the hard physical labor of his younger years, and he proved to have inherited his father's skill with animals and his mother's good business sense. He married a local girl named Sarah in 1902, and soon there were grandchildren running through the ranch house, filling it with laughter and chaos. Lily expanded the restaurant, buying the building next door when it became available and doubling her seating capacity. She had her mother's gift for creating dishes that people remembered and talked about, but she also had innovative ideas about marketing and customer service that pushed the business to new heights. She married the town's new doctor in 1904, a young man from back east who'd come west seeking adventure and found love instead. James completed his law degree and returned to Idaho to practice, eventually becoming a circuit judge who rode through the territory dispensing justice with wisdom and fairness. He married late, finding his match in a schoolteacher who shared his passion for education and improving their community. Together, they established a lending library in Challies that became a source of pride for the whole region. As Harrison and Tabitha moved into their 50s and then their 60s, they gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of both the ranch and the restaurant, content to let their children take the lead while they offered advice and support. They spent more time together, taking long rides through the mountains they'd always loved, sitting on their porch in the evenings watching the sun set, traveling occasionally to visit James in his various postings around the state. The cabin they'd built their life in had been expanded and improved over the years, until it was a substantial home that reflected the success of their partnership. But Tabitha's favorite spot remained the main room with its massive fireplace, where she and Harrison had spent so many evenings over the decades. She loved to sit in her rocking chair with knitting in her hands, watching her husband doze in his chair nearby, and feeling the deep contentment that came from a life well lived. In the summer of 1923, as they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, Tabitha looked around at the gathering and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. From that terrified flight across the Idaho landscape in 1883 to this moment of abundance and love, her life had been transformed in ways she could never have imagined. And it had all started with a cowboy who'd seen someone in trouble and hadn't hesitated to help. "What are you thinking about?" Harrison asked, coming to stand beside her chair and resting his hand on her shoulder with the casual affection of 40 years of marriage. "About how one decision can change everything," Tabitha replied, reaching up to cover his hand with her own. "If you hadn't stopped to help me that day, if you'd just ridden past, my life would have been so different. I probably wouldn't have survived." "But I did stop," Harrison said softly, "and I've never regretted it, not for one single second. You've given me everything, Tabitha. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just working the land. You made me whole in ways I didn't even know I was incomplete." "We made each other whole," Tabitha corrected gently. "That's what real love does. It doesn't complete you because you were never incomplete. It just makes you better, stronger, more than you were alone." They stood together watching their legacy play out before them. Grandchildren chasing each other through the meadow, their children deep in conversation about ranch matters and town politics and family concerns, the great-grandchildren toddling around on unsteady legs while anxious parents hovered nearby. This was what they'd built, she and Harrison. Not just a successful ranch or a thriving business, but a family rooted in love and respect, a dynasty that would continue long after they were gone. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the mountain peaks, Harrison and Tabitha slipped away from the celebration to walk down to the stream that had been part of their property for all these years. The water still ran clear and cold over smooth stones, just as it had that first day he'd brought her here. The aspens along the bank rustled in the evening breeze, their leaves shimmering silver green in the fading light. "You remember what I said to you the night of our wedding?" Harrison asked, pulling her close so they stood wrapped in each other's arms beside the water. "You said a lot of things that night," Tabitha teased, smiling up at him with eyes that still sparkled with love and mischief. "I said I would love you today, tomorrow, and all the days after that," Harrison reminded her. "And I've kept that promise. 40 years of loving you, and it's still not enough. I want 40 more." "Then we'd better take good care of ourselves," Tabitha replied, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Because I want 40 more too. I want every day with you I can get." Harrison Nichols. They stood there as darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead. Two people who'd found each other in the wildness of the frontier and built something that would last beyond their years. The stream murmured its eternal song and the wind sighed through the trees, and everything was exactly as it should be in the end. They were granted almost 50 years together. Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1931, just a few months shy of their 48th anniversary, and Tabitha followed him less than a year later, unable to imagine life without the man who'd been her partner in every sense of the word. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery outside Challies, their matching headstones bearing simple inscriptions that captured the essence of their story. Beloved husband, father, grandfather. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother. Together forever. But their legacy lived on in the ranch that Thomas and his children continued to operate, in the restaurant that Lily's daughter eventually took over and expanded into a small chain, in the legal precedents that James set during his years on the bench, in the countless lives they'd touched over their decades in Idaho. More importantly, it lived on in the stories their descendants told about the cowboy who'd saved a young woman fleeing from danger, and how that single act of courage and compassion had changed both their lives forever. Years later, when great-great-grandchildren would ask about how the family ranch came to be, they'd be told the tale of how Harrison Nichols had cut off 4 men chasing Tabitha Daniels across the Idaho wilderness, how he'd sent them packing with nothing but courage and a rifle and an unwillingness to stand by while someone was threatened. They'd hear about the instant connection that had sparked between the two, about a courtship measured in days rather than months, about a marriage that had lasted nearly 50 years and produced a family that stretched across generations. And they'd understand, those future descendants, that sometimes love doesn't follow a predictable path or a reasonable timeline. Sometimes it arrives in a moment of crisis, wearing a cowboy hat and carrying a rifle, ready to defend a stranger without hesitation. Sometimes it grows from desperate circumstances into something stronger and more lasting than anything that comes easy. Sometimes the best love stories are the ones that start with someone being brave enough to help, and someone else being brave enough to accept that help and see where it leads. The ranch still stands in its mountain valley, though it's changed and grown over more than a century. The stream still runs clear and cold. The aspens still shimmer along its banks, and on quiet evenings when the wind is just right, some say you can almost hear the echo of laughter from a man and woman who loved each other enough to build an empire from nothing but hope and hard work and unwavering devotion. That's the true legacy of Harrison and Tabitha Nichols. Not the land or the business or the material success, but the proof that love can flourish in the hardest soil, that courage and kindness can change the course of lives, and that sometimes the best things in life come from being in the right place at exactly the right time, ready to do what needs to be done without counting the cost. Their story became part of Idaho history, passed down through generations as an example of frontier romance and the building of the American West. But more than that, it became a reminder that real love, the kind that lasts, is built on a foundation of respect and partnership and genuine care for each other's well-being. It showed that true strength isn't just physical courage in the face of danger, but emotional courage in the willingness to open your heart to another person and build something beautiful together. In the end, that day in October 1883, when a desperate woman fleeing for her life crossed paths with a cowboy who wouldn't look away, defined both their lives in the best possible way. It gave them each what they'd been missing: purpose, partnership, and a love that sustained them through all the joys and sorrows that 5 decades together could bring. And really, what more could anyone ask for than that?